Hello, this is Christian Perring, and this is a slideshow on the morality of polygamy and polyamory. I'm aiming to be fairly brief with these slides, although sometimes that's not so easy for me, but let's hope I'm able to achieve that. Let's start off with some definitions. Polygamy is simply the state of marriage to many spouses. And so it's marrying multiple spouses. At least that's one simple definition. Then there are two subtypes. When a man is married to more than one wife at the same time, that is called polygyny. And when a woman is married to more than one husband at the time, it's called polyandry. And then there's polyamory. Polyamory is the practice of or desire for romantic relationships with more than one partner at the same time, with the informed consent of all partners involved. So it's not cheating doesn't count as polyamory because then there isn't informed consent. Sometimes I'll also use the word monoamory because it seems like a useful parallel. Although I'm not sure you're going to find monoamory in the dictionary. The most common form of polygamy is polygyny, and it's still widely practiced in some parts of the world and has a long historical background. Most commonly these days it's in Muslim majority countries or countries where they have a sizable Muslim population. And so there's also a variation to what extent it is legal and accepted. India has a sizable Muslim population. In India, only the Muslim population is allowed to have polygamous marriages. The rest of the population is not. One big question is whether or not polyamory and polygamy are natural in some sense. And often some people say it's totally unnatural, some people say it's perfectly natural. So, I have talked in other places about how it is risky to make an inference from whether something is natural to whether it's right, and often that seems to be a big problem. Yet, it is interesting to examine whether or not polyamory is natural. And we have to think what we mean by that. So one area of evidence is to look at other animals, and our closest cousins are kind of gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos. Certainly, gorillas and chimpanzees are polygynous. They don't get married, but they have societies where alpha males and males who are high up in the hierarchy have multiple partners. And those males may deny other adult males sexual access to their females. So that is definitely a kind of a male-run society, at least in that respect. Chimpanzees live in larger groups, and so there's more negotiating, more coalition building, and so it may be that access to females is possible by other males, but they could be like preferred access to the alpha male's loyal supporters. One of our other closest cousins who get mentioned less often are the bonobos. They live in much more equal societies, multi-male, multi-female societies, in which females exhibit extended sexual receptivity, and so you get both polygyny and polyandry. Basically, there's a lot of sexual exchange going on between just about everybody. Maybe kind of controversially, we might want to look at hunter-gatherer societies in the contemporary world as a kind of clue as to how hunter-gatherer societies were thousands of years ago. Obviously, that's controversial because it's assuming that there hasn't been significant change, that they're just isolated societies which keep on going as they were, and that may be problematic. It may also be problematic to assume that hunter-gatherer societies are in some ways more natural than people in the West. Nevertheless, if we do look at those societies, and also trying to look at the architectural remains, the archaeological remains of those societies, it seems actually we find that what evidence we can find is it's predominantly monogamous. And maybe if there was polygyny, it didn't happen a lot. So that suggests that in humans, maybe that kind of polyamory and polygamy is actually just not the norm. If you look at the ancient world, you discover certainly lots of examples of polygamy. For example, if you look at the Code of Hammurabi, there were laws about polygamy and what was involved in that. So that definitely means that it happened. And then maybe not such a good example of polyamory is the sexual use of slaves, because certainly according to our definition of polyamory, that it contravenes the idea of informed consent. But in the ancient world, neither women nor slaves had a lot of freedom, so certainly it's relevant that the men would be able to use their slaves for sexual purposes. So certainly we would not consider that to be monogamy these days. It certainly seems that a lot of early human cultures were polygamous, and we see that in China, India, Africa, and the Americas. If you look at the Greek and Roman world, then men were not allowed to have more than one wife at a time. But it wasn't really disapproved of that a man would be able to carry on sexual relationships with multiple women. Now, when you're thinking about polygyny, we might ask, to what extent is it kind of widely practiced in a society? And simply mathematically, it's not going to be possible for every man to have many wives unless you have a great imbalance between men and women in terms of numbers. So if you have some men having more than one wife, then other men are going to have no wives. And it may be that in some societies there is polygyny, but it's only happens for those who are rich who can afford to support more than one wife. And certainly it seems that in some ways having many wives would be a kind of status symbol in the ancient world, in the same way as having many slaves would be a status symbol. So there's that to take into account. Ancient Judaism does have examples of polygyny in the Old Testament. And it seemed to be a relatively common practice in the ancient Judaic world. There was a break with polygamy with early Christianity, and the early Christians said that they were happy with marriage, but definitely not with polygamy. So, and that's in keeping with the practices of the early Christians, which was to be fairly what we would call sort of conservative. The idea is that sex occurs just in marriage, and sex has to be between a man and a woman. So early Christianity seemed to be kind of mostly practicing the morality that in some ways we still see associated with Christianity today. Early Islam is a kind of slightly complicated case. Certainly if you look at the life of Muhammad, Muhammad married his first wife, who was a widow, and that marriage lasted for 25 years. And after his first wife died, he married a total of 10 women over the remaining years of his lives. His lives, and so there was polygamy for Muhammad, and every one of his wives was a widow or divorced, with the exception of Aisha. The case of Aisha is a pretty controversial case, and I'll invite you to look that up on your own. So in early Islam, polygyny was allowed, but there was more kind of law around it. So the marriages had to be kind of real relationships, kind of real love, not just for the men to have sexual pleasure. And the men had a responsibility to treat their wives well and to kind of support them. So that required them having enough money. It also seems that in early Islam, one of the main justifications for polygamy was that in times of war, there was an imbalance between the number of men and the number of women, because men died in battle, which meant that with there being many more women than men, it's kind of made more sense to allow polygamy with one man having several wives. So as we've said, a lot of Muslim populated countries allow polygyny still today, and that occurs in West Africa, Southeast Asia, and that's the main exceptions to that are Israel, Turkey, and Tunisia. In the US, not surprisingly, polygamy is illegal. If you look at the map here, you'll see that in some states polygamy is a misdemeanor, and other states polygamy is a felony. And so there's variation in what sense it's illegal. And that's generally true for most predominantly Christian countries. Nearly every Christian country outlaws polygamy, although there are exceptions with the Republic of the Congo, Uganda, and Zambia. Now, with a lot of immigration going on, there's a question about what should European countries, for an example, do when you have immigrants who are already married, multiply married. And some Europeans will recognize polygamous marriages which have already been performed in other countries. Now, uh, there's definitely been a history of polygamy in the US, and we might look at various kinds of examples. The main ones, as we just talked about, Muslims moving in or living in Europe. There's also many Muslims, of course, living in the US. So the question is, to what extent is there unofficial polygamy in the US? And the estimates say it is probably something like 50,000 or 100,000 people in polygamous relationships. The other main case of polygamy in the US is with the Mormons, and that's especially practiced in Utah. Notably, polygamy was decriminalized in Utah in 2020. It's hard to know exactly how many polygamous marriages there are in Utah, but one estimate I saw said about 30,000 marriages. Now I'm going to talk about an academic article from way back in 1973, and this was an article in a magazine rather than an academic journal. I think it was sort of, well, I wouldn't swear to that. But the author is Paul Gross. Yeah, it's so it was published in Reason, which isn't really an academic journal. It's more of a magazine. And Gross makes a libertarian case for polygamy. So libertarians are all for freedom and small government and little restriction by government of what people do. So it makes a lot of sense that libertarians would be in favor of allowing people to get married. At least it seems to make sense at first. Getting married to more than one person. Gross refers to Ayn Rand, who's a famous libertarian, and although not one who I particularly recommend you read. So Gross's article is kind of interesting, even though it's so old, partly because it's back in 1973 when kind of things were a bit different. So it's interesting to kind of think about those differences. And in some ways, Gross's article has themes which are still in the existing literature. So it's interesting to see how it gets these things get set up back then. So Gross makes an empirical claim. He says it's possible to romantically love more than one person at a time. Obviously, that's an empirical claim. It's also going to depend on what we mean by romantic love. Some people might say that, of course, people say they can romantically love more than one person at a time, but in fact, if you really understood romantic love, then you'd realize that was just impossible because it's in the nature of romantic love to only be focused on one person. So there is a question about the definition of what we mean by romantic love. But if you have a definition which doesn't automatically exclude the possibility of loving more than one person at a time, then Gross is saying, well, as a matter of empirical fact, humans are able to romantically love more than one person at a time. And he points out, there can be advantages, practical advantages to being in a polygamous relationship, in a polygamous family. There's increased division of labor, things can be more efficient, and if you have more people in a family, then you have a kind of savings in terms of cost per person. So there are practical advantages there. There are also practical problems. Obviously, one of the big things that people often think about when it comes to polygamy and polyamory is the worry about jealousy. If you have one partner who's seeing another partner, it may be difficult for someone to really be okay with that. They may just have a lot of feelings that they don't like that, jealous feelings. And if you have multiple people in a relationship, there may be more opportunities for conflict. You also have to make more decisions. Those all could be problems. Also, in certainly the USA and a lot of Western Europe, practicing polygamy is unusual, and a lot of people would disapprove of it. I haven't personally had any of my neighbors kind of say, oh, they are practicing a polygamous relationship. Maybe they were, maybe they're not, probably they're not, but if somebody moved in to a house and they were practicing a polygamous relationship, people might at least raise their eyebrows, and maybe they would not be so friendly. It's not clear exactly what would happen. It's interesting to look at people's reports about that. Gross says, obviously all these things can be overcome. So practical problems are not necessarily huge problems. So all of that is kind of factual so far. Um, then there's a question about morality. Is there something kind of wrong about polygamy, polyamory? And Gross formulates that as saying, well, is there inevitably going to be conflict and conflict of interest between people, which would be morally problematic? Um, and obviously, one of the conflicts of interest is the idea that people are possessive. They are prone to be jealous. Uh, Now, it depends on how we think about possessiveness. If you think that somebody else belongs to you, then clearly, we might say, well, that's a mistake. Nobody belongs to anybody else. Even children don't belong to their parents in the sense of kind of ownership. In other sense, parents do possess their children, but in a much weaker sense. Uh, so, uh, so Gross says that possessiveness is a mistake, and you should not be possessive about somebody else in the sense of saying that you own them. Um, so I think that's something to kind of to think about whether that's a plausible idea, and if so, in what sense is it plausible? In what sense might you think it be a limited idea? Um, Gross also says that there's no proof that love is devalued and spoiled if one finds that one's spouse loves someone else other than oneself. So he doesn't think there's a limited quantity of love which then has to get thinned down or get smaller if you're dividing your love between two people. Uh, we might make a sort of similar comparison with parental love when parents have more than one child. Do parents of big families with lots of kids, do they love their kids less than parents of who just have one child? And I guess uh, in theory, at least we want to say no. Parents love all their kids equally, and having more than one kid doesn't mean that you love each kid less. So we might say, well, there's a sort of parallel with romantic love there. Um, Gross also says that if you think of love as something you're trying to win, so there's a competition for love. So if one person is loving two people, then those two people are both trying to win that person's love. Uh, Gross says, well, that's all just a mistake. That's people being insecure. You should not be trying to win somebody's love. You should just be who you are and let them love you. So he's definitely kind of saying that all these forces behind possessiveness are a kind of mistake. But then he says that's all well and fine in theory, but in practice, actually, polyamory he thinks is very difficult. He thinks you have to be very emotionally strong to practice polygamy. So he thinks weaker people, and he includes himself among the weaker people, are better suited to monogamy. So he thinks that polyamory, polygamy are just basically difficult things to achieve, and it's easier just to have one person at a time. He also says, well, there's a kind of if you have multiple partners, then there's a question about who is having sex with who, and it may be required to have bisexuality, and that could be a problem because not everybody is bisexual. Uh, so he says that in fact, lots of people have a lot of insecurity, and also people are brought up to believe in monogamy, and it can be difficult to overcome the kind of your upbringing. So you may sort of believe in theory that polyamory is a great idea, but if you haven't been brought up in a polyamorous culture, just may find it quite difficult to actually achieve. So his conclusion then is that you know, polygamy, polyamory could work really well if for the right people, if they're uninhibited, they are very rational, and they are also living in a libertarian civilization which celebrates liberty. But he thinks in the real world, in the world as we have now, it's actually very difficult to successfully carry out polygamy. Um, so let's kind of think a little bit about Gross. Uh, I mean, Gross is talking about polygamy as a form of multiple marriage. Uh, One comment to make is that if you're going to be a libertarian and you want the government out of people's lives, then you probably want the government out of the marrying business altogether. So then what we would have is no official government sanctioned marriages. You wouldn't go to your local justice of the peace to get you married. There wouldn't be any divorce law as such. There wouldn't be regulations on marriage as such. Rather, what you would have is when two people wanted to get legally bound together, they would draw up a contract between the two of them, and they would go to a lawyer and they will both sign the contract. So that would be an entirely private matter. You would never go to the town hall to get married. You would just see your own lawyer and draw up a contract. Uh, so then, I mean, it seems like then you can certainly have multiple contracts. So it doesn't seem, well, Gross doesn't really seem to notice that true libertarians don't believe that marriage should be something that government is involved with in that sense. Um, all right. Another thing to say is that quite a lot of the stuff he's saying seems we might think of it as a little idealistic, and it's worth noting that there he was in the early 1970s, and he's saying that love should be free and everybody should be capable of loving many people. So that sounds pretty much like the 1960s, 1970s hippies. Where they're living wearing flowers in their hair. It takes the idea that love is special, and that therefore the more love you have, the better that society should be. You should love everyone, and we shouldn't be restricted by a kind of old-fashioned ideas of jealousy. And we shouldn't kind of think that sharing your love with multiple people is diminishing your love. So all of that is kind of certainly kind of reminiscent of the free love movement of the 1970s. Um, all right, so you know, the fact that Gross as a libertarian is kind of in favor of polyamory, um, that's pretty remarkable, and it's interesting. And I guess one of the reasons it's sort of remarkable is that we tend to think of libertarianism as a right-wing idea, small government, whereas the idea of supporting polyamory seems to be a kind of more liberal idea. So in this case, it seems that uh, the kind of right-wing beliefs lead him to embrace a kind of left-wing idea, which is fine. Uh, all right. So I think that's it for now. I think I'm done. I'm just over half an hour. So thanks very much.